Thank you so much. It's so good to see all of you here in person, and we have quite a few online participants, probably people who could not bear the heat, and or their determination ran out because like we've been all powering through the week despite the heat. So that's why I really applaud all of you to be here. It really shows the importance of the topic for all of us, the timeliness of the topic, and our joint commitment to move this agenda forward. So we have a very packed agenda. I'm not going to take a lot of time setting the scene because we have a brilliant panel, actually three brilliant panels and keynote speakers to really set the scene on the importance, on the pathways, and on the next step to take an agenda forward. But I would like to acknowledge our partnership with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in making this happen. We started it from an idea, and it's great to see that it's coming to fruition, and we are looking forward to see what comes out of it and what are the priorities we can take forward through different policy forums, different international, regional, and national forums together. So as I said, we have quite a packed agenda. That's why tea and coffee and some snacks are there outside of the room. So, and we don't have a break. So if you feel like you need substance to keep you focused on the topic, please don't hesitate to quietly leave the room and bring your water or coffee inside. We also have a colleague with an extreme allergy to oranges. So if you have any citrus fruit in your bag, please don't take it out, don't peel it. And with these two housekeeping points, it is my pleasure to hand it over to Hans-Peter Lanke, our Managing Director, for some welcome remarks.
Thank you, Mariam. And I'm really glad that we can offer air conditioning here. I thought there's sort of a carrot to join this conversation, but there are, of course, many other reasons to be here. And so as Mariam has said, I'm Hans-Peter Lanke, Managing Director here. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all. I also want to repeat the warm welcome to FAO, and we look forward to a good partnership on these issues. We had a couple of conversations earlier already, and hope to have them with many of you about how we can take this, how we can see this sort of as an initial brainstorm around how to put this issue on the agenda in the coming month. At ODI, our work is centered on how to build pathways towards a more equitable and resilient future in this very rapidly changing world. And climate change has, of course, made that question more urgent than ever. And the challenge is no longer just environmental. We're living through one of the largest economic and social transformations of our time, one that is reshaping development trajectories, financial systems, political stability, and the future of international cooperation itself. We're all very aware of that. And history teaches us that transformations of this scale are not going to be neutral. They redistribute power, they redistribute opportunity and resources, they create winners and losers. And unless they are managed deliberately, they can deepen inequality and they can reinforce existing vulnerabilities. This is why just transition has become such a defining issue in global climate debates, and we have to keep it there. Because the real question is no longer whether economies must transition, it is whether that transition can happen in ways that create more equitable, resilient, sustainable societies. And at ODI, we see food systems as one of the most important frontiers of that agenda, and I believe that's true for everyone who came here, because that is what our session today is about. Because food systems sit at the intersection of key challenges in the climate and development debate today: climate resilience, especially of women and girls, biodiversity loss, economic opportunity, health, energy security, secure livelihoods, and so on. But yet, despite this very central role, food security questions have remained largely absent from global conversations on the just transition. And that omission matters because those millions already living on the front lines of climate vulnerability, farmers, informal workers, rural communities, and especially women, risk losing out. If climate action fails to improve livelihoods, if it fails to reduce structural inequality and to strengthen resilience where vulnerability is greatest, it will struggle to succeed. It will struggle to succeed economically, it will struggle to succeed politically. It will build those antibodies against change that we have to help overcome. We all know the evidence that climate vulnerability is not gender neutral. Women farmers and food workers often face the greatest climate risks while having the least access to land, to credit, to insurance, and to decision-making power that are needed to adapt. Those things we have learned over the last few years. We need to put them very centrally on our agenda when we think about the climate transition. This conversation also comes at an important moment of growing geopolitical fragmentation, of shrinking development finance, of rising debt pressures. And as these pressures intensify, the question of who gets financed, whose priorities shape those global agendas, and who ultimately benefits from climate action are becoming increasingly contested. Now, these are precisely the questions that ODI has long worked on, and it is why our partnership with FAO matters so much, because we know that you're dedicated to these issues as an organization. So together, we hope to help ensure that agri-food systems are recognized as one of the central development, climate, and justice challenges of our time, that they are recognized within the international fora and processes that are dealing with the climate transition, that are dealing with climate finance. They're recognized in the run-up to COP32, that they are not dropped at COP31, that they're recognized perhaps also within the G20 finance fora next year. The UK is quite committed to these agendas. Can we build these bridges? And so now where attention turns to these fora, when it turns to Turkey and Antalya, and then next year to Ethiopia, where questions of implementation, inclusion, and fairness will become increasingly critical, let's make sure that food security is centrally on that agenda. Thank you all for being here. And with that, I give it back to Mariam.
Thank you, Hans-Peter, for reiterating the importance of this dialogue that we are going to have. And I'm over the moon seeing all of you here. I really didn't think that the heat, I thought the heat would prevent everyone, but I love the commitment. Without further delay, I'm going to invite Kaveh Zahedi, Assistant Director General and Director of Office of Climate, Biodiversity and Environment of the Food and Agriculture Organizations of the United Nations. Kaveh.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hans-Peter, and thank you to ODI for co-convening this session with us today. It's an important conversation and it's a good touch point. It's not that it's going to resolve everything here in the room, but it's a touch point because so many of us are working on similar issues that if we can come on together on are going to be much more powerful. I was asked just to give some sort of framing remarks for the conversation we're having today. I guess we need to sort of begin with the reality that many farmers are facing today. Those of us who've been here this week have been complaining about heat all the time, but extreme heat is now an absolute reality for farmers, for agricultural communities, for rural communities, and it's something that is turbocharged by global warming. There's many examples. One that really struck me when we did a recent report on extreme heat was the case of Morocco, which demonstrated how all of these events are sort of coming together in an imperfect storm that is really affecting agriculture and food systems. If you cast your mind back a couple of years to 2023, 24, Morocco was coming out of 2 or 3 years of drought. And then suddenly there was an incident of record-breaking heat waves, extreme heat in 24. And the impact was immediate. Cereal yields were down by 40%. 40%, almost halved the yields of cereal. Livestock production, of course, plummeted. There was nothing to forage. Wildfires consumed about 20,000 hectares of land. So it's the imperfect storm. And we saw the same scenario in Brazil the year before that. You might remember the drought followed by extreme heat, followed by the forest fires, the feedback loops that then caused floods, all of it impacting agriculture and food systems. And of course, it's a crisis that's affecting farmers and their families. So it's not just, of course, about Morocco or about Brazil. Farmers are really often the first to feel the impact when these kinds of crises hit. Hans-Peter, you said we all know that they're on the front lines, but somehow that knowledge is not translating into the mechanisms that are being set up, the finance that is being distributed. And I think that's why we're here, because farmers are being forced to make pretty hard choices. I'm sure Elizabeth will talk to us about that. Right now, it's about paying more or using less inputs, fertilizers in particular. It's about risking lower yields, selling assets, reducing their own food consumption, absorbing losses, basically, that they are not well placed to absorb. And the consequences of all of this ripple far and wide, because food insecurity comes at the same time as reduced nutritional content in so many different crops because of a changing climate. You have, on top of that, lost livelihoods, higher food prices, inflation, and that cycle continues. So all of this really is a very long way to say there is absolutely no credible transition towards sustainability and resilience without agri-food systems, or much more precisely, without the people who are behind our food. A just transition is not credible without rural communities, without farmers, without considering agriculture and food systems. So what do we do? I think I'd like to offer you just 3 sort of entry points for this conversation. I think number one is that we need this recognized in the international sphere. You mentioned the G20 and UNFCCC, and I think that they're absolutely key for the recognition. Food and agriculture and farmers still remain within the UNFCCC, I think very much a footnote in the just transition conversation. Decisions at COP30, I think were very welcome, because for the first time, the decision on the just transition explicitly recognized smallholder farmers, food production, rural economy actors. It's a good start, but of course it's not enough to reflect the true scale which farmers are affected and affect indeed climate change. We have a clear entry point within the UNFCCC. The conversation right now about the just transition mechanism gives us an entry point for putting farmers, rural communities at the center of this just transition conversation. It's a mechanism that was created under the COP30 presidency of Brazil. And right now, parties are discussing how to move the mechanism from design into action. And it's critical that food and agriculture are part of the design of this mechanism. We've seen from our experience previously that if the agricultural communities, if food, if agriculture is not part of the conversation at the get-go, shoehorning it in is very difficult in the past. It happened with the Green Climate Fund, you would remember. It happened with the UNFCCC itself. So that's why it's so important to make sure we're part of this official conversation, and make sure that food security, poverty eradication, the rights of rural and indigenous people, all of these critical issues of the just transition are embedded in the mechanism. I think there's a second entry point, and it's really solutions. We have a lot of solutions, and I think we need to get better at going from the science to the policy, from the science to the solution. And this is a little bit of a bridge, because I'm so delighted that Professor Jim Skee, the chair of IPCC, is here with us. We had Jim and lead authors, experts with us on the discussions related to IPCC's 7th assessment in FAO headquarters this year. Again, to do exactly the same as I mentioned with the just transition mechanism, to make sure if there are gaps in our knowledge of agriculture and food systems within the climate science sphere, how do we fill those? So the next assessment is a complete picture and provides us with clear entry points or solutions. So it wasn't just a pleasure to meet you again today and welcome you and the community to FAO this year, Jim. But I think it gives a critical signal that food and agriculture is indeed an integral part of the scientific discussions for the next IPCC assessment. We don't have what I was hoping for, which is the special report, which you're very familiar with. But I think in a way that there's some positives, because agriculture and food systems should sit across all the working groups, and indeed it does, and that's what we're working towards. But what is it that we're working towards? I mean, when it comes to farmers, it's not just asking the farmers in a just transition to do more with less, to cope with whatever comes their way, but it's about helping to sustain livelihoods, helping to sustain decent work, helping farmers and rural communities have access to social protection, which is such a key when it comes to building resilience and adapting to a changing climate. It's about helping to have access to clean energy, resilience, and you name it. And to do so, I think we need the science and data that can tell us and tell farmers which seeds and breeds perform the best when we have heat waves, when we have droughts, what preventative measures they should take before climate extremes hit, where sustainable and affordable alternatives exist, and to some degree, where are the trade-offs? And we have to manage those trade-offs. And this is why we've put so much emphasis at FAO in our collaboration with IPCC and scientific bodies, because it's that evidence that is translated into action and is translated into investments. And that's what exactly we use as the basis of all of the funding that we go after to help countries deal with climate change. A third entry point, and final one, if I may mention, a building block for just transition, and I touched on it just now, is of course finance. We can't do anything if we don't get the finance flowing in the right direction. So many of the conversations around London Climate Week have been around finance. Some of them, or many of them, as usual, are there's lots of finance and there's not enough bankable projects, and I think that's beginning to feel like a bit of an excuse. If you look, the OECD DAC just published as a preview of what ODA looks like, and it's the trends are down as you would expect, including on climate tagged overseas development assistance. It's still above the 100 billion, thankfully, which was a political but an important political mark. But I think the worst news is that the shrinkage is even bigger for the funds that go towards agriculture and food systems and the kind of solutions that we hope to offer for farmers, for rural communities to adjust to a changing climate. It was only 4% of the climate-related development finance was reaching the food production sectors the last time these numbers were released. And then we're talking about crop, livestock, forestry, fisheries. You're familiar. These are the investments that are so critical. Otherwise, where are you building resilience? Yeah, what are you adapting if it's not these sectors? So these are not simply investments in production, as it were. These are investments on building buffers for all the things that we've talked about. When climate change intensifies, when we have extreme heat, when we have prolonged droughts, all of these, including, of course, this year with the El Nino setting in. So let me wrap it up there and just say that all of these three factors, I think we need to somehow address and bring together. And I'm delighted that we have the possibility of touching on each of them as we have the conversation throughout this day. Let me finish by thanking all of you for showing up in the heat, and of course our dear partners at ODI for bringing us together in this beautiful room. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaveh. So we took 3 points being a part of the conversation from the get-go, importance of finance and bridging science and policy and action. And with that, it's my honor and pleasure to welcome Jim Ski, the chair of Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, to give us some pearls of wisdom and keynote remarks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mariam. I do feel privileged to be given the opportunity to just say a few remarks at the start of the session. Now, just to say, I feel humble about this because all of my background is actually in energy systems. But let me try and rescue my credibility by flagging the fact that I am hosted by the International Institute for Environment and Development as chair for this cycle, which is giving me a lot of opportunity to engage with relevant issues. In the last cycle of IPCC, I was co-chair of Working Group 3 and co-led the management of the special report on climate change and land. And I'll also say that for 5 years, I chaired Scotland's Just Transition Commission, which took a deliberately broad framing of just transition issues, and it encompassed both agriculture and the demand side, as well as the supply side. And I may say that was not an academic exercise. I was holding the ring with businesses, trade unions, community groups, and farmers. We had real farmers on the commission, so we were addressing the issues. So I'm going to draw very briefly on the remarks from the Special Report on Climate Change and Land and the Just Transition Commission, and then say what we're planning to do in the 7th assessment cycle. So turning first to the IPCC land report, the summary for policymakers did not mention just transition explicitly, but it made many, many relevant points. This was back in 2019, before the concept of just transition acquired the prominence that it has now. It particularly noted the issue of insecure land tenure, affecting the ability of people, communities, and organizations to put in place practices that advance adaptation and mitigation. And it noted that the limited recognition of customary access to land and ownership of land increases vulnerability and reduces adaptive capacity. So there was a set of sections on relevant land policies, which include recognition of customary tenure, community mapping, redistribution, decentralization, co-management, and regulation of rental markets. All can provide security and flexible responses to climate change. It further made the point that given the complexity of the challenge and the diversity of the actors involved, that it's a mix of policies rather than any single policies that are going to produce solutions. So obviously, the policies included improved access to markets for inputs, outputs, and financial services, empowering women and Indigenous peoples, which is very, very pertinent this, enhancing local and community collective action, reforming subsidies, and promoting an enabling trade system. Now, my head of communications at IPCC, who's sitting in the second row there, asked me not to describe my IPCC role as head in the clouds. Let me call it eyes to the horizon. But in contrast, my role in the Scottish Just Transition Commission was really, really feet on the ground. And I was privileged to have two roles at the same time that kept the bigger global vision, but combined it with local practices and what could be achieved. So I am not going to suggest that there are directly transferable lessons to be learned from one corner of Northern Europe to other parts of the world, especially as Brazil beat Scotland 3-0 just this week. But what the Just Transition Commission did was to highlight for me the importance of local context and the critical role that land tenure plays. Scotland has an unusually concentrated pattern of ultimate land ownership. Some people say it's the most concentrated since Mexico before the revolution. It really is very important. So tenant farming plays an incredibly large role. And as we engaged with farmers, most of the conversation were about the things like the complexities of multi-generational leases that pass from grandparents to children before they expired. And the interesting questions about the ownership of assets at the end of a lease when it expired. So the livestock belongs to the tenant, but the fixed material, the trees, the hedgerows belong to the ultimate landowner. And these kind of things have really, really strong incentives about the choices that people make. Now, the other thing about the difference between IPCC and the Just Transition Commission, IPCC, we are required to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. The Just Transition Commission, in line with its mandate to offer challenge to ministers, was unashamedly policy prescriptive, and it was liberating to take on that role and follow it through. So some of the recommendations that we followed through were on sectoral just transition plans. And one of them, which is currently in draft form, addresses land use and agriculture. And what is very interesting is that within the Scottish Government, it's owned jointly by two different portfolios. The portfolio on climate action and energy, but also the portfolio on rural affairs, land reform, and islands. And I think that's a really important point, that that this cuts across government. I note that in a previous Scottish Parliament, climate action and land reform were in the same portfolio. And frankly, the minister spent 90% of her time on land reform, which was a really, really tricky issue in that context. So the draft Just Transition Plan for Land Use and Agriculture, it's still draft, but it is already built on a strongly of stakeholder engagement. And I think one of the themes that comes out there, the need for place-based approaches. People who have knowledge and understand locality need to be involved in decision-making right from the start, because policies that are framed nationally limit flexibility. They don't account for the subtle variations that take place at local levels. Second theme around equity, value, and respect. And just noting that a disproportionate share of profits and other benefits from natural resources often leave the areas where they're generated. And if they stay within the area, they may not be fairly distributed within communities. And there's a perfect example about ownership of wind energy resources when we went to the remote islands of Scotland, where people are generating power at a lower cost and are still paying mainland prices for electricity, which is a great source of offence. So these kinds of issues do really matter. And I think a third theme was on communication, collaboration, and innovation. People need to be aware of how interconnected rural activities are and how farming and land use brings benefits for the wider environment as well as the locality. And without that appreciation, it's going to be hard to change behaviour and move the policies forward. Now, these messages are grounded in real-world experience, but I think they do echo the more generic conclusions coming out of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. Local context is everything, but there may be commonalities that we can learn from one part of the world to the other, and sharing experiences can help ensure that nothing falls between the cracks. It gives a set of criteria to test against. So let me finally turn to the plans for the IPCC 7th assessment report. So Working Group 3 on mitigation, which is my home territory, has a set of systems and sectoral chapters, and there is one on agriculture, forestry, and other land use, conceived as an inventory category almost. And as in all of the sectoral chapters, mitigation is going to be assessed in the context of sustainable development, justice, equity, health, and well-being. And that's a big development for the Working Group 3 report. So a common theme across all the sectoral and systems chapters is going to be the relationship between mitigation actions and measures to enhance sustainable development and adaptation, covering risks, co-benefits, synergies, trade-offs, and spillover effects. And that chapter will explicitly consider gender and the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in co-designing and implementing mitigation measures. Working Group 3 is also have an entire chapter dedicated to development, mitigation and sustainability. And this does explicitly mention just transitions and unpacking them at sectoral, regional and national levels. Now, Working Group 2, obviously incredibly relevant here on impacts and adaptation vulnerability, does have a chapter on agriculture, food, fibre and fisheries, which covers livelihood security, risks to cultural heritage and adaptation options for vulnerable groups, including smallholder farmers, pastoralists and fishing communities. I'd just like to flag there's an unprecedented degree of collaboration between the working groups of IPCC in this cycle. And given these strong linkages and the very strong commonality and synergies between adaptation and mitigation actions in the land use and agriculture sector, we're expecting to see that fully exploited in the current cycle. I wasn't going to say this, but I was just reminded by the remarks. We have actually taken each of our vice chairs in IPCC and given them a focal point role with respect to the constituencies within the Framework Convention. So we have a focal point for the farmers group and try to engage with them in each COP and in each meeting of the subsidiary bodies. Now, one other thing I just wanted to flag. Earlier this year, we ran a workshop on engaging diverse knowledge systems, which covered Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and practitioner knowledge. And just one little advertisement, that workshop report is now on our websites, and the recommendations represent a consensus between IPCC insiders and the holders of Indigenous knowledge who participated in that workshop. I just say the mood around that meeting was good. We were very nervous about it, but we managed to get people to work together and we all parted friends. One final plea on this. All IPCC reports go through a rigorous review process, expert in government. So the Working Group 2 report's going out for expert review in early October. The Working Group 3 will come shortly afterwards. So please register for the reviews, download the drafts and submit your comments. We do value a very wide range of perspectives and all reviewers are acknowledged in the final published report. So with these couple of little advertisements, I'll draw my remarks to a close and I'm looking forward very much to the rest of the symposium.
Thank you very much, Jim. You gave us a lot. And I think you also set the scene for the 3 panels that are going to follow. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Mary Duport, a senior fellow in ODI and senior technical advisor to Alliance of Small Island States, to initiate the panel, the first panel on why just transition must include food systems. And so Mary, please, and I'm going to invite the panelists one by one. We have Eddie Frank was adaptation coordinator for AOCs from Dominican Republic. Welcome, Eddie. We have Harjit Singh, farmer and founder of State Sampada Climate Foundation. Please, Harjit. And last but not least, I would like to welcome colleague and friend, Rachel Waterhouse, Resilient Ecosystem Lead, FCDO UK.
Good day and welcome to the first panel on just transitions and agri-food systems with these amazing guests. We're going to dive right into the first questions for each of the panelists. So I'll turn now to my esteemed colleague, Eddie Frank Vasquez, and ask Eddie, what are the key barriers to sustainable food systems in small island developing states, and which particular groups of producers and stewards of the natural environment in SIDS are most affected by climate shocks and stresses and in need of targeted just transition support?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mary, and hello, everyone. So when it comes to a small island developing states and agri-food system, there's a reality we cannot ignore. We are dealing with small territories that are usually not fully capable of producing enough food for their inhabitants. And there's a reality that that particular scheme brings us that we depend a lot on import systems, specifically for food. Depending on import for food is quite concerning, especially taking into consideration the complex reality that we are all living right now when we look at the geopolitics, where any single oil price, where a geopolitical difference between two or more countries, which may not involve seeds at all, but has implication on how the shipping system also works for us or against us. So let's start with that structural barrier. Most of seeds depends on more than 80% of food imports on a yearly basis. That means that most of the food depends on other country producing food. And at the end of the day, that's a reality that we cannot even ignore. In the case of the Dominican Republic, where I'm coming from, we consider the country to be kind of in a very good state when it comes to food security, but there's a reality that is impacting small farmers. When it comes to the import that we receive from other countries, the prices that the small farmers need to compete to are quite shocking. So most of our people in the Dominican Republic prefer to then consume goods when they come from outside of the country, which leave an issue of, well, prices are higher, locally speaking. There's no way that you can compete if you don't have an incentive mechanism in place for small farmers. And also when you don't actually take into consideration how all the system also engage itself in giving consumers, but also producers a fair shot when it comes to maintaining the balance into the agri-food system. So the import situation is quite difficult for a small island state when it comes to that reality. The second reality that we also need to take into consideration is the behavioral perspective of a just transition system when we talk to agri-food systems. We're talking about technology, we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about policies and incentive in the global and national framework, where most of the time we don't take into consideration which are the changes that are needed both from producers and consumers in order for them to scale into this just transition system when it comes to agri-food more specifically. So that's a concern that when it comes late into the conversation, then it is too late, because we expect people to act rationally when we are creating a system. Then for most of the time, they are created from, they take years to be created. And at the end of the conversation, then we deal with the behavior change. And that's quite concerning because people need to understand what is happening, the awareness, the implication, the motivations, the social incentives that are in place for people to be engaged with a specific goods or a specific mechanism or even practices when it comes to the production of food. Is quite necessary to take it as a cross-cutting issue when we're putting these frameworks in place. And I think that having that into consideration in the ongoing conversation in the UNFCCC right now is quite important as well, because even though it's a global framework, we have to take into consideration that it will go from top to down to bottom at some point, and we need to be prepared for that conversation. The third point that I want to mention is also the options that we have in place in order to be able to scale just transition systems. In the Dominican Republic, particularly, that we are both an importer and exporter of food, we face a dilemma. We're a big exporter of rice, for example, but the production of rice is quite water intensive. So even though that we are dealing with an economic system that is bringing economic flow to the country because of the exportation, we are not taking fully advantage of the whole technology and techniques that could make this practice even more sustainable, environmentally speaking. And the gap between the intention of doing it and actually doing is sometimes the policies that are in place locally in order to do that transition. And that's where subnational mechanism, local mechanism, but also national mechanism enter in place when we try to deal with the different stakeholders involved. So taking those three barriers into consideration, I will say that especially local community, rural community, local farmers, generations of family that have been dedicating themselves to the maintenance of the land are quite of the most impacted, but also fishery communities and coastal communities as well that depend on a specific agricultural mechanism to survive. So when we put all these cards over the table, we're talking about a very complex system for small island developing states.
Thank you for the comprehensive response, Eddie. Very much appreciated. And we'll come back to you on good practice examples from the DR later, I think. Turning now to Rachel, the UK since COP26 in Glasgow has been very active in promoting just rural transitions. Tell us how you conceptualize that. What does that mean? And what are the opportunities for taking it forward under the UNFCCC?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks so much, Eddie. That was like, it's so interesting and important to hear such a grounded overview. Thank you. So, I mean, I obviously preaching to the converted here, but I wanted to sort of revert a little bit to the sort of the question for the panel on why agri-food systems are so important in the transition and how we see that. And I think the sort of the current situation that we're in sort of geopolitically today also really brings that home. We've talked about the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. We've talked about the coming impacts of a really intense El Nino, what that means for fertilizer and food price rises, for food insecurity. But these, and we tend to look at these as isolated events, as another sort of in the string of crises. But actually, these are actually symptomatic of structural fragility in our food system. And I think that's something we need to recognize. Agri-food systems obviously are at the heart of our food, our diets, but also our economies. And the way that we produce and consume food currently, so both farming is very vulnerable to the kind of the impacts of climate change, but is also playing a part in driving greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, and economic instability. I think the current crises then sort of, they're yet another crisis, and our tendency is to think about sort of quick reactive responses. You know, how can we mobilize more money to respond to the crisis? How can we sort of expand fertilizer subsidies so that farmers can still have access to fertilizer to produce food? But if we respond in that way, we're missing the drivers of this challenge. And this is where we come to the need to really sort of think about what are the underlying structural fragilities in our system. That means that we have, that we need to think beyond a very sort of reactive response towards more strategic systemic change through transitions. And that's where we need to think about systems transformation. So what does it mean to talk about agri-food systems transformation? And then, so we know that it is going to be critical. We know that agriculture and food systems are not only driving a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, that percentage is likely to rise to 2050 as we sort of reduce the carbon emissions from the energy sector, and as demand for agriculture and food products increase. But it's also driving, this is very interlinked with wider aspects of environmental degradation. So it is key to looking at agriculture and food systems is key to reaching our climate goals, but it's not about reducing emissions in isolation. And I think this is really important when we're looking at how do we bring agri-food systems into the UNFCCC, but also other global forums like the G20, like the G7. So the ultimate goal is not actually about carbon. We need to have agri-food systems in the climate change conversation, but the ultimate goal is affordable, nutritious, and sustainable produced food that is accessible to rural communities, to women, but also to us, to ourselves here in the UK and elsewhere in the world. So a just rural transition, a transition in agri-food systems is critical to decarbonisation, but it's not just about that. It's about addressing a much wider set of complex and interrelated risks to our environment and to our economies. which depend so much on agriculture and food. But that very complexity might help to explain partly why food systems transition is lagging so far behind energy transition, because it is so complex, it's politically sensitive, and such an important part of all our lives. So food systems are lagging behind in the UNFCCC formal agenda and in the real economy transitions that we need to make. But there are entry points. My colleague from FAO, Kaveh, you referred to the Just Transitions Work Programme, for example, which is one kind of critical entry point, which recognized the need to promote inclusive whole of society approaches to accelerating climate resilience. And the fifth dialogue for the first time really sort of centered on agri-food systems. As Kaveh said, we now going towards COP31, we'll be looking at the next work program for just transitions, as well as how to operationalize that just transitions mechanism. So that's sort of one entry point for getting agri-food systems into the center of the climate agenda, but in a more comprehensive way. But the evidence and the ethics behind this approach isn't new. And at least since COP26, I think in the UK, as well as promoting a just energy transition, we've also been promoting what we've called a just rural transition, which is kind of recognizing agriculture and food systems, but as a sort of as a much wider set of complex issues. And we've been looking at sort of three critical levers for change that align with just transitions, which is around scaling innovation, policy action, and then getting finance into the right places. And I'm not even going to say mobilizing finance, and I'll come back to that. So science and innovation need to complement, not replace, local knowledge and expertise, but we do need new tools and approaches to increase sustainable productivity in a world with more demand in a changing climate. So how can we promote that? Whether it's through inputs like drought resilient seeds, solar powered irrigation, bio inputs and mixed blends of fertilizer, to the sort of digital tools that can help reach farmers and that can help with sort of soil mapping, give farmers more choice in how they're sort of dealing with climate change, which can all contribute to transition and breaking some of the dependence of our food systems on fossil fuels, restoring nature and building resilience to climate change. But in investment in this type of inputs and approaches, to do this, we need also the right policies and instruments in place and the right market signals to help kind of scale this adaptive capacity in agriculture and food systems. And this is where we come a little bit to sort of finance and policies as the other two levers. And while there is obviously a role for development finance, for climate finance, which can help to catalyze change, that is never going to be enough on its own to bring in the kind of, to scale the kind of adaptation that we need to see. But I also, and this is very much a personal perspective, so it's not it's a personal perspective, but I really want to go away from sort of talking about how do we fill the finance gap to how do we actually redirect finance to mainstream finance to be flowing into adaptive and resilient production, and flowing to where it needs to go. Because for all the money that flows into development finance, which is shrinking, there's a huge amount. We say there isn't money for agriculture and food systems. There are billions and trillions of private investment into agriculture and food systems, just that it's not helping to support adaptation and resilience and to reduce mitigation. So there is no silver bullet on how to make these shifts, and priorities are going to differ according to context, but a few common threads would include land rights, and Jim spoke very far more eloquently than I about the importance of land tenure and land tenure security. So that's sort of one area to recognize and register land rights, helping farmers to get access to finance, to the insurance and credit, and the resources for adaptation. We also need standards and metrics. So to set a level playing field for investment, I talked about getting finance into the right place, and quite often, and so I think there's increasing recognition now that even from sort of bankers and investors, that there's increasing sort of climate and environmental risk in agriculture. So it's thinking about how do you set a level playing field for business and for private sector investment through standards, through metrics, so that they are encouraged to de-risk their investment and to introduce resilience building measures. That could be, for example, through improving water management or setting standards for water management. And that's something that in the G7, the central bankers are talking about, how to really sort of build risk and resilience into water management in financial decision making. Another key instrument, and I'm sorry, I'm nearly at the end. It's just money hiding in plain sight. It's the public subsidies that go towards agriculture, which are well intended, but sometimes are delivered in a way that is very rigid. Like, so for example, blanket fertilizer subsidies, delivering a fertilizer for maize crop to farmers, that doesn't enable adaptation and flexibility. So this is also an area for intervention where working with governments to sort of redesign public policies and support to give farmers more flexibility and adaptive capacity. For example, moving from input subsidies to e-vouchers. We just to wrap up finally then, so through some of the work that as FCDO we've been kind of engaging with and promoting, we're collaborating with the World Bank on sort of policy reform and public expenditure reform to help countries redesign their subsidy programs so that it's enabling farmers to take a more flexible response. And we're also working with civil society partners to sort of build and foster a community of practice around just transition, bringing in farmers organizations, civil society organizations to bring their voice to the table on policy reform. We've just recently launched at COP31 through our partner Climate. They've launched an initiative called the High Level Panel for Just Rural Transition, which is chaired by the former president of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado Quesada. And it's just to mobilize more attention and more understanding about the benefits of investing in sustainable agriculture and ensuring that the civil society organizations, that rural communities, that women's organizations have a voice in how that is shaped and determined. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And very clear there that you were picking up the issues of the structural fragilities in the agri-food systems, which Eddie had also introduced. And it's so good to hear that FCDO is working on reforms and particularly farmer choice and flexibility. So now to a farmer, Harjeet, it's lovely to see you. Welcome. I think I may have seen you scurrying around the corridors of Bonn in the climate negotiations, right. But you do also, in your day job, you are a farmer. So tell us about it and your two lives, if you will. What is the reality of what you're dealing with on the ground? And is the international system rising to the challenge? And if not, what can be done about it?
Thank you so much, Mary, for having me and such a great conversation. I'm sure you must be surprised when people call me farmer because you find me more in the conference halls than on the ground. There are some videos which you can actually find where I try to connect, and I'll talk about that in the second part, that why you find me more here and than on the ground when I'm going to talk about a gap that exists and based on our experience. But coming to what we are seeing right now, it's very clear that the global just transition conversations still have a very industrial lens and focus much more on the energy side, and agri-food systems continue to remain a an afterthought. And that's exactly what we heard in the morning session. And because of the conflict in the Middle East, as Rachel was also saying, we are now beginning to realize that how the supply disruption can cause food crisis and has intensified the unavailability of food or inaccess that we are seeing. Now, we also talked about the challenge to integrate that in UNFCEC conversation. But let me give you a good news. If you look at the current text that is now going to COP31, which they are defining as bucket one, has some very good language. And after a lot of fight because of the conversation we had in the bond session, everything that we are talking about is there. It talks about smallholder farmers and women, informal workers, migrant workers, indigenous people, pastoralists, fishers. That has been mentioned, even urban and peri-urban systems, which you often see invisibilized in the conversation when we talk about agriculture policy linking with climate. Agroecology is also having a special mention in the current text as a valuable approach. Of course, it's all bracketed right now, and we need to work hard to make sure that we protect it as we go to COP31. And it also refers to farmers, the impact on farmers because of price fluctuation and the disruption in the flow of fertilizers and so on. However, we are still not looking at the fertilizers and the fossil fuel nexus that actually exist. We know that more than 30% of global emissions come from agri-food nexus, and just 2% of emissions come from synthetic fertilizers, both production and use. Whereas the flow of finance, as we were also talking about, is not going to smallholder farmers, and on ecological practices, probably barely 2%. So really what is required on the ground and the kind of conversations we are having really not matching up. And even the conversation, as Eddie was saying, is very top down when it comes to solutions. We are talking about remote controlled tractors. We are talking about AI. We are talking about drone technology. We're not talking about the real issues of smallholder farmers, be it land, be it access to market, be it access to fertilizers, and how they are able to avoid food losses, and the cold chain that is required, the basic infrastructure. There's less discussion about that, and more money is flowing into these fancy technologies. And that's something that we need to really call out. And especially when we talk about just transition and impacts are increasing, we are talking about a sector which employs 25% of the population of this world. And the reality is that the focus still remains on very capital intensive agriculture and investments, which is not going to help smallholder farmers who are really providing us food and fiber and so on. So my plea is that we need to look at the ground realities and start talking about agroecology much more. We are seeing that traction happening in Europe. We are seeing that traction happening now in UNFCEC. The whole effort should be to protect what we are getting, and all the experiences that we have need to inform those conversations. Of course, integrating that in the UNFCEC or other frameworks is not going to be enough. Ultimately, it has to be translated into ground. So based on what you are saying in rural transitions and transformation that is required, and involving farmers, and really adopting approach where they are at the center, and particularly women farmers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Harjit. And may I also prompt the audience to be thinking of your questions for the panelists, because in a moment we'll be opening the floor to questions. That's both to the in-person audience and online, so do get ready. Before we do that, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to just come back to Eddie very briefly and ask Eddie a bit more about what the situation looks like on the ground in the Dominican Republic. Are there any good practices of regenerative or agroecological farming, food production systems that are inspiring you and that you would like to see supported through multi-level processes?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of knowledge, and every time that we hear people talking about the local experiences and what they have learned, there's a lot of knowledge that we can take into consideration to scale up in the pyramid of priorities, specifically when we talk about agriculture. And as you mentioned before, I mean, the complicated situation in this is that it's coming from the top to the bottom of the pyramid. So far, there's a lot of practices that are ancestor practices coming from and generations of family on how to do how to take specific actions and how to be more water conservative and how to have crops in a more efficient way, that could be a next level of consideration. And I think that the gap that currently exists between those reality and those experiences and taking that into policy and into action, then it is what I will say is a huge opportunity that we are currently missing. The systems are being defined right now, they are being negotiated, they are being shaped by international policy and phenomena. However, we need more voices on the ground in order to be able to those reality to inject into the pyramid. So in the case of the Dominican Republic, there's a lot of movements. I can recall a local program that was just launched a year and a half ago by one of the youth officers over there, that is regarding to maintain youth people in the land, in the rural communities. And it is something that we are seeing, that is the migration of youth people to the bigger city, but also outside of the country. We're losing the practice of keeping the land. We're also losing the ownership of the land. And opportunities and incentives to keep youth people not only on the land, but also to be able to get something in value out of it is, I will say, a huge opportunity that we shouldn't miss in the next few years.
Thank you. So from Dominican Republic to Scotland, as Jim said, we have some intergenerational considerations before us. I've just been passed a note by my colleague Mariam to say that the questions will be actually at the end of all the panels. So please do be thinking about them, but hang on to them because you'll get the chance to ask them of the panelists later on. So with that, I think I'm just going to invite Rachel and then Harjeet again to give any closing comment on what we've discussed, just for a minute, and then we'll wrap up this part of the session. Rachel.
Closing comment.
What you've heard from the two colleagues who are very nimble between their on-the-ground realities in South Asia and Caribbean, respectively, and the international negotiations.
Yeah, no, yes. Absolutely. And I think I'll probably sort of perhaps come back to that point that I was making about how we sort of look at this transition and how we look at the sort of the finance for transition. And I think that's something that I'd really like to be as a takeaway is that it's so important to kind of maybe get away from fixating on climate finance. It is important, it can be used as a catalyst, but we know that money is shrinking, and we know that it's not enough to bring in, it's not enough to finance a just transition, and it's going counter to mainstream finance. So my sort of closing kind of thought would be, let's get around this sort of, what more can we do to build risk and resilience into mainstream finance with agriculture and food systems at the center of that.
Yeah, thank you. I used to have a colleague here at ODI who gave the analogy of going on a diet. You don't just want to eat lettuce, you need to eat less ice cream as well. And that's maybe the kind of the analogy you could apply to the financial flows in agri-food systems. And with that, Harjeet.
Sure. I think this is the moment to zero in on the point that I would like to make, and I'm very pleased to see all the right people in the room. So I'm going to make my pitch. So, and my experience of directly working on ground. So, so my wife and I started this initiative called Satat Sampada, which is a Hindi phrase. Satat means sustainable, and Sampada means natural resources. And it actually came out of frustration after Paris Agreement. We all know that, great, we got this agreement. We were walking in the right direction, but not as fast. And look at where we are right now. And that frustration pushed us to channel that energy to create this initiative. And we thought, let's start working on ground, because I can't survive in these conference halls all my life unless I'm rooted back to the ground. And that initiative, of course, we started talking to farmers, and my whole previous experience of working with ActionAid, Ruchi is here. She was leading the food work, and we were working on climate resilient, sustainable agriculture. And we thought, okay, whatever you call it, organic, natural, or regenerative farming, or agroecology. We started working with farmers, and my whole intention was to spend time in the rural areas. But guess what? They said, and we looked at various projects supported by European Commission and UK and many other donors. They said, we have been practicing agroecological farming or natural farming, but we left it as soon as the project ended because there was no support to continue, and we relapsed into conventional farming. And if you really want us to continue, go back to the cities and create market for us, which meant fixing the soil required fixing the market. And that was an eye-opener for us. And guess what? For the last 10 years, we've spent more time in cities to make sure that the agroecological farming is sustainable. We never made that connection. And I can also give you examples. And that's a blind spot that I want to highlight in this forum. If you look at the food systems principles, and we actually closely studied, if you look at IPES food principles, it only refers to diets to be nutritious and co-produced with farmers. And it doesn't talk about engaging with consumers. It does talk about a little bit on public health, but not enough. Similarly, Global Alliance for the Future of Food, GAF principles, talk about healthfulness, renewability, but really very top-down, not talking about consumers again. FAO principles do talk about micro-scale work, but they also stop short of identifying consumer federations as a structural partners. That gap exists. ActionAid principles do refer to consumers and engaging with their associations. And that's a huge gap. And that's a reality farmers are facing on ground. And the way I look at it, in fact, when we talk about fossil fuel, which is another hat that I wear, the fight that we are having in the fossil fuel sector is, or the energy transition sector, we say, we've worked a lot on the demand side, but not on the supply side over the last 30 years. You know that phrase? It's bang opposite in the food sector. We have worked with farmers all our lives over the last few decades. We did not engage consumers. We still see them as a passive stakeholder where they should eat nutritious food, but we don't engage with them so that they can create a sustainable demand, so that when we pull out with whatever support we are providing to farmers, it remains sustainable. We need to make sure that we guarantee that kind of income to farmers. And that's a big missing piece, which I really wanted to highlight. And I think we need to look at this blind spot. And let me say again, that if we really want to fix the soil, we need to fix the market. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well said indeed. And I think we'll wrap the panel there with the notion that for each of us, every time we go to the market and put something in our basket, we are voting or not for a sustainable food system. And we can be ambassadors for that principle in our work as well. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists.
Well, thank you very much. That was an amazing panel. And I am very happy that you heard it finish on a note of importance of consumers and market and the importance of like demand side, which we have all as food system community have been pushing throughout various COPs and various forums, but still we see that we have to struggle to secure any project even for urban food systems. And with that, it's my pleasure to moderate the second panel. Someone also reminded me that I did not introduce myself. So my name is Mariam Rezai. I lead food systems for ODI. And as I said, I'm honored to share this stage with some of my heroes, some of the people who have been working, following their work for years and years, and invite Elizabeth and Simadala, President of East Africa Farmers Federation, to join us. And Harji would be happy to see our next panelist, Jasmine Burgess, Director, Inclusive Climate Action at C40 Cities. And Ruchi's name was mentioned, Ruchi Tripathi, friend and colleague Director, Climate and Nature, Global Alliance for the Future of Food. And last but not least, Milagre Nuvunga, Executive Director at Mikaya Foundation, Mozambique. So I want to open this panel by saying that we used the opportunity of London Climate Week to launch the brief that you could find outside on delivering on gender equality, the missing piece in climate and food system policy. And when I was writing that brief, there were three messages that kept coming back: that climate shock disproportionately deepen inequality for women working across food systems, but also most climate finance facilities are designed for formal economies and excluding informal sectors. And those informal sectors are not only in rural areas, also in peri-urban and urban areas. And also that gender commitment in climate and food system policies, they are there in the preambles, but they rarely translate into funded action or real accountability. So I just wanted to set the scene with these messages and turn to our first panelist. I will start with, let's just shuffle it up a little bit. With Elizabeth. You represent millions of farmers across Eastern Africa, Elizabeth. And many of us have heard you speaking at various panels. From your perspective, what is the biggest structural barrier preventing women farmers from benefiting climate and transition finance? And what would it take to change it?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And it's really a great honor and pleasure for me to be speaking before this audience, but most importantly, to come after a lineup of speakers, the previous speakers who've really pointed out the most important issues that we need to listen today. And especially coming after my fellow farmer, Singh. I think he really spoke very well as a voice of smallholder farmers. So as mentioned, I'm Elizabeth Nsimadala. I'm a smallholder coffee and banana farmer from Uganda. I also add value to the bananas and produce banana wine. I don't know if there's any of you who has ever seen a banana wine. Fran, I think you can, yes. That is the bottle, yeah. So I also represent 25 million smallholder farmers under our network, regional network, the Eastern Africa Farmers Federation, with a footprint in 10 countries of Eastern Africa. Thank you. And for me, I think just to kick off the discussion is really, first of all, to recognize and appreciate the role and contribution of women to the agri-food systems as change agents, as stewards of nature, but also most importantly, just look at me. And behind my back, the photo, which is there on the screen, you can see the smile. And with that smile, what does it mean? It actually has a broader message that us, even with the impacts of climate change, we are very resilient. We always move on. We don't give up. So we are the backbone of resilience as women. And for me, that is the key message and the most important thing that I'm bringing here. And speaking about the barriers that women face, I think everything has already been pointed out, but maybe just to give it a farmer's lens. And I want to speak to, because almost every speaker spoke about direct access to financing, and which for me is the biggest barrier, especially for women farmers. Because we all know that financing is not enough and it doesn't trickle down to where it matters most, and that is on the farm. From the Family Farmers Climate for Action, which is a global campaign that we are running as family farmers from 11 regional, continental, and global organization, and brings together 95 million family farmers across all the continents. We are advocating for direct access to financing, because we realize that in terms of adaptation funding, less than 1% of that fund reaches the smallholder farmer. But then now, if that is 1% that reaches every smallholder farmer, then when it comes to women, I can't even imagine the percentage that the women receive. And part of the barriers that, of course, limit women in terms of this direct access to financing is what has already been alluded to, the access to land. Coming from Africa, we know our land tenure systems have not been pro-women because of our patriarchal nature. And so even when a woman wants to apply a bank loan, I give an example of myself because this has previously happened to me, just because on my form it has marital status married, then I have to seek for permission from my husband to sign on my form for me to be able to access financing. Because without his signature, then I cannot get financing, even when the land belongs to me in most of the financial institutions. So I think for me, which is really a barrier. And when you indicate that you're single, then your parents, and this mainly is your father, has to sign on your application forms for you to be able to access financing. So I think these are some of the policy issues also with regard to land access that need to be addressed, sorry, with regard to access to financing that need to be accessed, to be addressed. When we speak about land rights, we should mean it. The land rights, the land ownership, the land access. If I own my land, I should have the rights to use my land the way I want, not to be dictated by someone else. Then, of course, the other way to address these barriers is how do we create a dedicated fund for family farmers and especially women farmers. I know we've been speaking about financing, and I think it was the keynote speaker who mentioned about the challenges with access to financing. And among the challenges is because family farmers have not been directly accessing this funding, because we have so many prayers in between, so many phantom organizations that are speaking for and on behalf of the farmers. So the funding that is supposed to support the farmers end up in these organizations because they pretend to be speaking for and on behalf of the farmers. So what are we doing? As Family Farmers for Climate Action, we are advocating for reforms in the financing architecture so that we can attract both public financing, we can attract the private financing and philanthropy financing. And we are moving forward to co-create a farmers empowerment and resilience fund. So that then with this kind of fund, the farmers are able to access this funding directly. It is able to address the barriers that currently exist with the current funds. And maybe I could point out one of the funds like GCF, for example, because we all know about that fund. When you look at some of the barriers that bar women to access this financing, is first of all, the ticket sizes. They're very big. And as a farmer, I'm not looking at maybe $30 million US. I'm only looking at $1,000 US to buy an irrigation, a small solar irrigation kit, or $2,000 US. But again, this big ticket size, because it is big, the farmers cannot meet the requirements to be able to apply for that funding, because again, the requirements are so high. The bar is set so high that the farmers cannot meet the requirements. And then the other challenge is also around the accredited entities. When you look at most of the accredited entities under, let's say, the GCF funding, a number of them are not pro-farmer. They don't understand this smallholder farmer narrative. So again, it becomes so difficult that for smallholder farmers to access the funding, because it's either an accredited entity like Africa Development Bank, which is an institution, a banking institution, and maybe does not really understand that smallholder landscape. So it's important that we address these barriers that hinder women from accessing this fund. And the solution that we think is going to be very suitable is having that Farmer Empowerment and Resilient Fund. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And yeah, you brought out so many elements and issues that even in our work as like global development practitioners, we have been, advocating for like the land tenure collateral for banks. But one thing strikes me, because yesterday we had a panel and we had a banker, a CEO of a private financial institution on the panel. And what you said about ticket size being big for most women farmers, what she was telling us was that the ticket size for agriculture and food security projects are too small for to attract private finance. So it's interesting to kind of look at different angles and really tailor, like what kind of finance, the typologies of the finance. And I'm really worried to talk about finance in front of my boss, Hans-Peter here, because he's coming from the finance sector, but really to start thinking through not only availability of finance, but also access, quality of the finance. And with, yeah.
If maybe you could allow me to speak to that. I was meaning these big funds like the GCF funds, or maybe again, if of course there are also these differentiations when you speak about the GCF, and maybe the JEF funds are small grants that are also targeting communities. But also what is available, the funds are also, like you've said, small and not enough. The Africa Development Bank actually speaks about the lending portfolio to the agriculture sector and puts it at 5% in Africa. So meaning the funds to the agri-food systems are already not enough. But also when you look at the investments by our governments, for example, with the CADAP, the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, which we are now running at 3.0, that speaks about our governments investing 10% of our national budgets to the agriculture sector. They've really not been doing this for over 20 years. Most of the African governments have not done that. My own country, for example, has been around 3% of the investments to the agriculture sector, again, which makes the resources very, very small to be able to reach the women farmer. So again, like you're saying, of course, speaking from different angles in terms of what is available and how to access what is available, but also the impediments regarding to access the bigger funds so that we can unlock.
Yes, I mean, thank you so much. I think you have given us so much food for thoughts, and also because you touched on land tenures and patriarchy and women in access to decision making, I'm going to turn to Ruchi, because you have been working a lot on these issues over the years. And yeah, as we were hearing, that much of the global just transition debates continues to prioritize technology-driven solution, like Harjit was mentioning. But there are structural inequalities, particularly women unequal access to land resources and decision-making, that they receive far less attention. So you have worked in this space for a long time. Why do these underlying issues remain so marginal in climate and food system transitions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, firstly, thank you, Miriam. This is a topic really close to my heart, and really excited to be sharing the panel with such amazing women here. So I think it's really important to understand, whose risk capacity are we talking about, right? Ultimately, it is women's labor, women's time, and their risk. So women farmers, women laborers are the ones who are preserving and working on the soils. Whenever you go to these large conferences, it is and in talking about transition to a more agro-ecological food system, bankers will talk about their risk-taking appetite and completely forgetting ultimately who bears the burden, who is, and women's labor is completely invisibilized in this discussion, in the debate. So I think valuing that, valorizing that, starting from that is really, really important. So I think when something remains invisible, it is not appreciated, right? So I think I would just sort of start from that. And I think shifting our conversations to really grounding it in the realities. I think, I will, talk about, a couple of examples from our current work and tying it to what Harjeet was talking about as well, and maybe some frames to help us have this conversation. One of the approaches that we've been housing at the Global Alliance, we're a philanthropic alliance of foundations. For several years, we housed something called a True Cost Accounting Accelerator. So really talking about the true cost of food. So looking at natural capital, social capital, environmental issues together. And we're really thrilled to see this approach being really mainstream now with several FAO reports coming on board. What I'm hearing more and more recently is stop talking about the cost, because even if we know the cost of agrochemicals on women's bodies, on the destruction for the environment, it's not shifting things. So the framing that people are now suggesting is talk about true benefits, right? I mean, our agroecological system really is providing the benefits for women, for nature, for society. So how do we transition to actually valuing the current food system? And let's stop sort of incentivizing the polluters. All of the current financing mechanisms are to stop the polluters from polluting, right? I'll give an example from the women in Cerrado. This is an old example from Action 8 Days. And really, all the efforts are in stopping deforestation in the Amazon, rightly so. But in doing so, we end up working with the farmers to incentivize them to stop polluting, not with the women who have been tending to the Cerrado for decades, right? So how do we shift the incentives? How do we really visualize this work? I think is really important. And then two quick examples again. So coming to the land issue that you started with. So one of our members is supporting the Women's Land Rights Initiative, Robert Bosch Foundation. They're working with Huarai Commission, TMG, a think tank in Germany, and the secretariats of the 3 Rio Conventions, because none of the Rio Conventions would be able to achieve their objectives without a focus on tenure security and women's land rights. So again, we invite you to join us in that initiative. And I wouldn't just stop at land rights. I think I would also want to call out the recent ECARD conference, which talked about agrarian reform, which we are so afraid of talking about in today's age. And I was so happy, Jim, you talked about Scotland. And I think this issue remains unspoken of, the issue of land distribution, agrarian reform. So I just wanted to bring that back. And my final example is around sort of place-based work. So our members, again, have been supporting this agroecological regenerative transformation in 6 geographies and really costing out. So we had made a commitment to transition our, many of our members' funding towards agroecological regenerative approaches. So working with partners like Pelham, farmer organizations, governments, bilaterals, costing what the transition would cost in 6 geographies, and then thinking of different forms of capital and their role, and when they come in. This, and this really ties back with something you said, Harjeet, around markets and this, so I think we've got a colleague there from Rockefeller Foundation. They've been really making this connection with school meals and how can we use school meals as a lever to transform agriculture, right? So regenerative school meals and connecting farmers with institutional markets is another sort of example. And of course, within all of this, the role of women and their knowledge and their capacity remains. And the final point I would say is in the fertilizer transitions that we're all hoping for to happen, let's consider at the moment, again, the fertilizer subsidy goes to the companies ultimately, right? And if we're moving towards more agroecological approaches, bio inputs, let's think through where the labor will fall and how we transition towards more agroecological approaches. And yeah, thinking of the women farmers and laborers in that scenario as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruchi. You started with saying and finished with saying that we need to keep in mind from the outset, we need to keep in mind whose risks and whose capacities and who bears the burden. And also you touched on, again, markets and also cities, which brings me to Jasmine. So I am personally a big advocate for, like rural and urban and peri-urban food systems. And I think it's dangerous how, underappreciated this element of food system. This element is missing in our food system thinking, and how everything is very focused on national and rural context. So we know that cities depend on large informal food economies. So what are the lessons that cities have learned about ensuring climate action improves livelihood and working conditions for informal food workers, market vendors, producers, particularly women?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks. It's been so great to hear all the different perspectives. Yeah, and I think you made a really good point just to start, which is that, you mentioned that the urban perspective is often missing from the discussions on food, or not present enough. But actually, that's the same case for the just transition discussions. So it's actually a really key opportunity. We also engage a lot in the things that have been talked about, the just transition mechanism, the just transition work program. And it's very much often seen as a national conversation and not one that is about subnational and about what's happening at the urban area. And that also negates a whole range of different elements of sectors and climate action that's underway, and food is obviously one of them. So just for a little bit of context for those of you who are not aware of C40 cities where I work, we're a network of 97 of the largest cities globally, mega cities in global north and global south. And we work in partnership with these cities to advance ambitious climate action, as well as ensuring that this is equitable and inclusive. And of course, that bring those two together, such as through food. And I wanted to actually just build on Harjeet's points, because I was hit all the right points, but just maybe with some stats to sort of put some context to it. But 80% of the world's food is expected to be consumed in cities by 2050, and it's currently at half now. So you can see the significance of cities in the urban dimension is going to just grow, both for producers and consumers, because it's obviously interlinked. And when it comes to food insecurity, 76% of the world's food insecure are actually in cities as well. So that shows like the importance of the urban perspective in this discussion. But also, when we think about a just transition, there's a really key element around green jobs and skills, which exist in terms of the food system, and also how that plays out in cities. We know already there's over 1 billion people in urban areas that are already engaged in agricultural activities, and with elements of migration, and it's going to increase. And that's a key topic in the just transition discussion, is how you ensure that these workers are having actually, good working conditions, they're contributing to some of these key interventions. And so the point that you were making about informal workers, and also what that plays out in cities, is very key, because in the majority of the cities that we work with in the global south, most of the employment is actually informal. And when we hear from our cities, that's one of the areas they're most interested in ensuring. How can you ensure like a just and inclusive transition? And within that, women are very much a key part. If you think about processing, packaging, market trading, all the key elements, that is where there is a large gender dimension. And so how we have been working with our cities to think about this, there's some general principles that we say across the board in terms of what an urban just transition looks like, and what we what we support cities to look at, ensuring that when you're thinking about interventions or support to certain groups, think about an equity assessment to ensure that you think about where women may be more impacted. And that really applies to some of these discussions, but also the points that everyone has made about including them in the process and in the discussion. And so we've seen examples if I give the example of Freetown, which is one of our member cities, where there's a huge intersection between women being key in the food selling operations informally, and also being very affected by some of the other things, extreme heat, and so forth. So the city has been looking at how they can sort of formalize the employment of some of these of some of the female market traders, particularly to look at how they can have social protections as part of that process, so they have more secure livelihoods. We did a really interesting study with the city of Freetown on the female food market traders, looking at a loss and damage perspective, particularly, and looking at how the food, there's so many issues: health risks by food spoiling, health risks to the female food sellers because they are out in the sun all day, and then also loss of income because of the loss of food as it spoils and isn't able to be sold. So thinking about all these challenges, and the city has a really unique role because it's much more agile than a national government, because all the ministries are in like one house or one, and so that you can actually pilot interesting ideas that are able to show what a just and inclusive transition can look like in practice, that could then be scaled up from some of the other discussions.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And yeah, I think we all agree that cities are more agile in terms of reacting or even be proactive. But are they capacitated? Are they empowered? And are they included in food system decision making? This is something that I think is for other discussion. But thanks so much, Yasmin, for giving us your insight from the perspective of urban consumers and also how they're affected, the informal sector. Now turning to Milagre. So you have your own, you have the foundation, you have been working for a long time with communities, women, strengthening their economic capacity and community resilience, and working a lot on sustainable livelihood in rural Mozambique. What have you learned about designing intervention that address these challenges that we have been hearing, but not in isolation? Is there a way that is there a silver bullet or an intervention that we can, look at all these challenges, or do you have lessons that have worked to bring more integrated thinking and problem solving into this context?
Well, thank you. Just like the last speaker of the previous panel, having been in this fora, like international fora, discussing several issues, particularly from an environmental point of view, also with my husband, we went back to Mozambique and created Mikaya, and he's here as well. So, what made us do that was also that sense of frustration that we sometimes have, that we are talking about something and we are not getting there fast enough. And then we decide to go back and just try and do something and see if what we think about can work, how we can test approaches, having learned so much from everybody from around the world, how we can go back to a place and really test those approaches that we believe could also contribute to the solutions of many of the issues that we are discussing. And so through Mikaya, what we did was constitute this hybrid entity called Mikaya, where we have a foundation and a social enterprise in recognition of what was mentioned here very often, of the importance of not just investing on the production side, but also looking at the market. And so from the very beginning, having this organization from having a foundation, but also having the social enterprise that will then partner with communities, with producers to really explore those markets in domestic markets, but also international markets. And so through this, we have built over time, since 2008 that we are doing this in Mozambique, 3 companies, one on tourism, one on honey, another one in baobab, exploring those, linking farmers, linking communities, rural communities to urban consumers but consumers everywhere in Mozambique and abroad. I wanted to give you just one example of a company, Baobab Products Mozambique, which through interactions with the community, we found that there was a specific product that was being traded only by women, mostly because men realized that there was no value. It was not being valued enough. It didn't warrant their time. And so when we discussed about baobab in Mozambique, we knew that baobab was already being traded as a superfood in Europe and US and elsewhere. And it was there. It was very abundant in that space. In all the conversations that we had, we realized that that particular value was not realized, and therefore that product was not valued in those communities. And so, and because it was women-led, they were just selling in their backyards, let's say, or at the edge of the road. We started engaging these women in knowing more about the product, about the value, etc., but also about the standards that the market required for them to be able to access those markets. And so this process of learning and engaging and practicing means that today we have a company, Baobab Products Mozambique, and it's an inclusive business that includes 3,500 women now, rural women, who are collectors, but also who are represented through an association. And so there's a benefit sharing mechanism inbuilt in that. And we are exporting like 40 to 60, between 40 and 60 tons of powder, baobab powder, mostly to Europe. And so it's just a small example. And in other cases, for instance, with Mozambique Honey Company, which is another one that we built in a value chain that was mostly male dominated because of the technologies that were used in that particular industry that required the bark hives, let's say, to be placed high up on the trees, and therefore women they were not allowed to climb trees, and therefore they were prevented from participating in that. But just by changing the technology and working more in apiaries, we're able in some places to bring almost to 50 or more % of women involved in that particular value chain. And we have Mozambique Honey Company Limited, which is a company that we created with those producers to be able to put this high quality and award-winning honey into the domestic market, which is being recognized in international markets as well, with all these, with the benefit sharing mechanism that they entail. And so there are approaches out there that can be used, should be used to make sure that we work on these value chains in a more inclusive way, because sometimes it's just either tweaking the technology or really showing how valuable these products are to be able to then tip the scale. And the reason why I'm talking about, I'm not talking about maize or something else, I'm talking about non-timber forest products, mostly because we don't look at, very often when we talk about agriculture or food systems, we talk mostly about farming per se. But we normally talk about, when we look at farming or food systems, we look at it in a more integrated manner, because be it, particularly in rural areas where people depend on soil and natural resources around them, integrating this is important. When we talk about agroecology or whatever sustainable agriculture system, we are talking about how we can integrate the natural resources that exist in that place and value them enough so that deforesting is not an option. Actually, it goes against the interests of the community itself, because they know there's a value for this somewhere. And so it's, I just wanted to say also that context does matter. We can talk at this level about more generic or issues in a generic term, but whatever system that we talk about or we end up implementing, it's important that we allow, I think it was mentioned here, the flexibility is important. Flexibility of not just of policies or financial systems or whatever it may be. That flexibility is key for countries to be able to adjust and be able to take advantage of whatever systems are put in place. And so one last point I wanted to make is about knowledge systems in all of this. How, for us in Mikaya, the starting point is the knowledge that exists in the places where engagement happens. And so, but also that that time is important. Long-term engagement is important, because we need to give time for this, the learning to happen, for us to learn, for everybody to learn from each other, so that we can see what it is that we have in a specific space, what markets exist, what markets we can create if they don't exist, and we believe that there is a space for that, and how then along the time we can build the knowledge, not just how we can integrate knowledge, traditional, bring in research and academia to be able to really build a strong basis for growth and development.
Thank you so much. It was. I think we heard so much from, we all have so much to take away with us from this panel, and at least at ODI, we are going to, because this area of work on really bringing in women empowerment, informal sectors, cities into the just transition discussions is an area of work that we are going to focus more on. And you have given us so many priorities to start thinking through and seeing how we can advocate for that in our respective global forums, but also how we can help you to to build the capacity, like Milagre was saying, and I know that Mary and others are engaging with you in discussing what capacity is needed, and also working with cities, and which we are already engaged, farmers, and also other partners, to bring the voices of the vulnerable group, of the marginalized group into this discussion, and make finance and policy work for the people who really need them and depend on them. Thank you very much. Please give the panel a round of applause. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Simon to moderate the next panel.
Thank you, Mariam. Hello, everyone. I'm Simon Addison. I'm senior economist at the FAO, where I work on inclusive climate action and lead our work stream on just transition. And I'm going to moderate this final panel, where we've already heard a little bit about other systems that are not based in agriculture. We heard from Jasmine about cities. We're going to think a little bit beyond food production on land, to think about food production in oceans, to think about urban food systems, to think about cows, because they're so important to the just transition agenda from an emissions as well as a livelihoods perspective. And also to hear a little bit more, as we've heard already, about the question of small island developing states. So I'm going to call on my friends. Aditya, where is Aditya? Aditya Bahadur is the director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Oh, very, very, very good. Janine Haj Hamoud from the International Institute for Environment and Development, who is fisheries and blue economy expert. We have Anthony Whitbread over there. Anthony comes to us from the International Livestock Research Institute. Are you based here or in Nairobi? Tanzania. And finally, we have Matt Bishop from the University of Sheffield. Thank you, Matt. So to get us kicked off, we've already heard a little bit about cities, Aditya. So let's deepen our thinking there. As we've heard, often when we talk about agri-food systems, we're thinking about farmers, we're thinking about rural areas and food production in the field. But cities are at the heart of our agri-food systems. We've heard about how cities are growing, urban populations are growing, and food security is a very significant challenge. In your work at the Red Crescent Climate Centre, you do a significant amount of work on thinking about climate risks as they're developing in the future. How are you seeing food risks in cities linked to the risks that rural areas face in the coming years and decades? And what can cities do to address those risks in ways that will be just, inclusive and equitable?
Simon, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm delighted to be back in my former home, ODI. So I think to begin with, I just want to spit out a few statistics. About 55% of the world is now urban. About 30% of everyone who lives in cities lives in informal settlements. So that's a huge amount of people that account for urban informality. Jasmine rightly said, about 3/4 of food insecure people in the world live in cities, and roughly about 30% of everyone who lives in a city or a peri-urban area is food insecure. So the scale of the challenge is huge. And I'm mentioning these statistics because when we talk about food security, urban areas are not the first thing that come to mind. It's still thought of as a largely rural problem, whereas the scale of urban food insecurity is immense. Now, I am a firm believer that if we are to make progress on enhancing food security sustainably and effectively in cities, we cannot do that without a firm and meaningful engagement with informality. And I say that for two reasons. One is structural, it's about values, it's about equity, it's about principles. But the other, frankly, is functional. If you want to have effective interventions that enhance food security, you cannot overlook 30% of a particular population. And remember that 30% is a useless statistic that aggregates the reality of a Stockholm and a Mumbai. Mm-hmm. Some of the world's most food insecure cities are up to 80% informal. So to think that formal policy will radically transform the food security landscape of urban contexts across the global south, I think would be incorrect. Now, there are three ways in which I would argue we need to appropriate informality when thinking about food security. The first is an appropriation of informal knowledge. Any plans and processes for enhancing food security must appropriate the lived reality of the informal economy, of the informal sector, of people living in informal settlements. History rarely provides you with controlled experiments, but there's an incredible example from Indonesia, where as part of a national urban regeneration initiative, they were working on urban food markets. And in two cities, they adopted two radically different approaches to enhance food markets, where food stalls are set up, where street vendors aggregate, where people can access food, where people can sell food. In one city, it was a top-down, elegantly planned initiative where a blueprint was prepared, food vendors were evicted, relocated to another place. It was a disaster. In another city, it was a process of co-creation, where food vendors were invited for a dialogue to help co-design what this new food market would look like. And that was an incredible success. And of course, I'm essentializing a hugely complex case study, but that was the principle that local knowledge can really make the difference between a successful policy initiative, a successful transition, and an unsuccessful one. The second thing I would like to underline is we must find tangible, real ways of including informal actors in processes. And maybe I'll just take a slightly left field example here and talk about barefoot doctors. Barefoot doctors in China, many of you would know, were semi-trained, quasi-professional, kind of medical, a cadre of kind of medical assistants that fanned out across the Chinese countryside to rapidly meet the burgeoning health needs of China's growing population. And so they were formal, informal type of actor that really brought an immense amount of benefit to large numbers of highly vulnerable people. This model has been appropriated in urban design, in urban regeneration, through the idea of barefoot planners, where in places like Swaziland, in Ghana, whenever there's a slum, well, not whenever, many times when there's a slum regeneration initiative, they would hire a cadre of people from the slum that is to be regenerated to be part of the planning process. And what these individuals do is broker trust between a formal system of planning and an informal way of living, and leads to a much more effective, much more sustainable solution. At the cost of eating up my time, I'm going to give you one small example from Accra, where barefoot planners were invited to be part of a slum regeneration initiative. And thanks to them, the government realized that a slum that was earmarked for eviction and relocation had far more people living in it than the government anticipated. And therefore, if they had gone through with their plans without the engagement of the barefoot planner, they would have an internal displacement problem in the city. And so they decided to not demolish, evict, relocate, but brought basic services to the slum to upgrade and enhance the settlement. So this is an analogy on how we need to include informal actors in cities to be part of the solution. And there are, of course, food security related examples from peri-urban areas, which are the areas where a lot of food production happens. The third thing that I will end on is understanding and including informal practices. Urban areas are not inert, empty contexts in which you can insert a new agenda for food security. There's a hell of a lot that's already going on there. People are producing food, people are consuming food, people are bringing food from outside, people are taking food from inside to outside. And therefore, understanding what's going on in cities is absolutely essential to then understand which are the practices you might want to strengthen, which are the practices you might want to include, which are the practices you might want to slowly think about changing through processes of co-creation. I'll stop there.
And this is, in your book, Resilience Reset, you speak of autonomous frugal innovation, which is, can you expand a little bit on that and how that relates to what you've just described?
Thank you for the plug. Simon, it's available on Amazon.
But it's a fascinating idea of this autonomous frugal innovation.
So I've been obsessed with this idea of jugaad that many of the South Asians in the room would be familiar with, which roughly translates as frugal innovation. It's been poo-pooed by sort of Eurocentric, top-down, scientific approaches to innovation, but has delivered immense benefit on the ground across the global South. And in a paper that I did when I was at ODI, actually, I captured a whole lot of practices on how jugaad innovation can enhance resilience at the ground level, from looking at the ways in which a fridge in India designed with clay called Mitti Cool helps reduce temperature by about 15 degrees inside the container without any electricity, just through passive cooling, to new kinds of ways of enhancing ventilation within slum settlements. Overall, what I'm arguing through frugal innovation is precisely this, that when we are trying to introduce new ideas or innovations to change the status quo, we must recognize that there are existing metabolisms and ecosystems of innovation that are already taking place. And an understanding of those need to be appropriated before we jam through what we think is a vision for change that we think is objectively good.
Wonderful, thank you. So you've really made it clear for us the scale of the challenge of food security and transforming agri-food systems in beneficial ways for cities and particularly for informal settlements, and highlighted the importance of inclusion, participation, and empowerment, but also leveraging these autonomous local innovations, that's a fantastic innovation for extending food life, supporting food chains, etc. So thank you, Aditya. Janine, we've been hearing a lot recently about the importance of the blue economy as an area for investment and for delivering a climate smart development pathway. And there was just a large conference on ocean economies in Kenya last week. But your research has shown that small scale fishers often experience the idea of the blue economy as a threat rather than an opportunity, and that they can be squeezed out by larger commercial and conservation interests. So how can we make a just transition for coastal communities and marine food systems genuinely inclusive for those who depend on them the most?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you for having me here. I think throughout the discussion, we've really heard a lot about what the gaps are. And I think I want to start off by acknowledging the compounding layers of invisibility here. So within the agri-food, within the just transition, agri-food systems are largely sidelined, but within agri-food systems, blue foods are largely sidelined. And then on top of that, small scale fishers are often at the margins of the blue economy, more capital intensive parts of the blue economy, including industrial fishing and large scale aquaculture and so on. But small scale fisheries are extremely important. 1 in 12 people, I'm going to do your thing and throw in a statistic there. 1 in 12 people around the world depend on small scale fisheries for their livelihoods, nearly half of them women. So they're extremely important. But the risk that comes with any sustainability transition is that if we're not centering, and I'm preaching to the choir here, but if we're not centering the voices of the most marginalized and vulnerable people in the sustainability transition, then we risk reproducing or making worse those vulnerabilities. And so, for example, for a fishery to be climate smart, it needs to be sustainably managed. Fish stocks and aquatic ecosystems are generally more resilient to climate pressures if they're not exposed to as many pressures. So they're just more resilient. But these management actions often come at a cost. And local people are typically expected to bear that cost. So to give an example, like a seasonal closure. So you close a fishery for a few months, allow populations to regenerate so that it can be harvested at the end. That temporary closure restricts food and income in the short term. And so a just transition really needs to mitigate those sustainability costs. But also, and we've heard about this from other speakers, really take into consideration equitably distributing the benefits. And so a lot of our research at IIED for the last few years has looked at the tools to do this. And so we've spoken about social protection, and so that's a really key thing here. So social protection for fisheries management. We've also spoken about, and again, it's easy to think about these things only in terms of land, but tenure is really important in coastal, marine, and inland environments. So yeah, really thinking about the process of securing tenure and property rights, and doing things like providing positive subsidies. And so ultimately, I would say like the just transition is really about making visible and valuing the people that rely on and make aquatic food systems go round, and ensuring they have meaningful say in decisions, but also ensuring that really importantly, that the costs of sustainability are mitigated properly, and that the benefits of a sustainability transition are equitably distributed.
Thank you so much, Janine. And I think these are messages we've heard throughout the morning, really. Inclusion, taking the most vulnerable into account, making sure that the mechanisms and systems that are set up are available and accessible to them, and that we put their interests at the heart of things. It is, just to reiterate, it's so critical that we take the blue economy and fisheries and small scale fishers, and particularly women, into account in this discussion. And you're quite right, it is sometimes sidelined in the formal discussions. So if there's one thing to take home about the blue economy, it is that. Anthony, you work for the International Livestock Research Institute, and livestock are a a hot topic when we come to questions of mitigation in the agri-food system, but also livestock contribute a very large proportion of global greenhouse gas emissions, but they're also the critical for the livelihoods of millions and millions of pastoralists and small-scale agro-pastoralists and farmers. How can we design a transition in agri-food systems that is genuinely equitable for those who depend on livestock for their livelihoods, but also whose cultural identities are deeply invested in livestock? And what can we learn from pastoralists about how to deliver a just transition that is going to be successful?
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I'm based in Tanzania. I'm one of the directors on a program called Livestock, Climate and Environment. The program works very much around this smallholder livestock space, trying to link adaptation and mitigation with productivity. Many of the systems we're talking about are smallholder farmers. They're resource poor smallholder farmers and livestock keepers. But I think most people understand that livestock is central to nutrition. Meat, milk, eggs, particularly for young children, pregnant women, are extremely important for nutrition. Livestock have some great outcomes in terms of equity and transition. Often women are the ones controlling certain livestock value chains. Poultry is a great example of women being involved and having access to income. Dairy is another one. Small ruminants is another one. So there's some wonderful outcomes of livestock systems, but sure, they have some pretty big environmental challenges. I would say that industrialization is happening as well at the same time. In Africa, Asia, the demand for livestock products is almost exponential. There's demand for meat, milk, eggs, and we have to understand that this demand is not going to go away, even if there is an environmental footprint that we don't like about it. So our role a bit is about trying to link, develop the smallholder farming systems in an equitable way, in an environmentally friendly way. And I think the industrialization processes will continue to occur, but there can be this interaction between the smallholder sector and the industrial processes that will happen no matter what. The big footprint, I think, of livestock is when we talk about ruminants. Camels, cattle, small ruminants, goats and sheep. They ruminate, they eat low quality material, they eat grasses and legumes, and they belch methane. And methane is a powerful greenhouse gas. It's responsible for 12 to 15% of all greenhouse gases. So it's a massive, massive effect. And it's also a gas that has a short half-life, but it also has a very severe effect on global warming. So it is something we really need to get on top of. So we have all these challenges, don't we? We have demand for food, we need nutrition into the populations, we need income, but we also need to reduce the environmental footprint of these systems. ILRI and its partners work in the context, and we approach it from various ways. I would say in developed systems, commercial systems, there's quite a few options for trying to reduce methane emissions from livestock. There's additives to feed, there's other things like that. But in our context of the developing world, those may come eventually, but I think the challenges are more about how do we firstly focus on productivity and improve the emissions intensity. So make more milk, more meat, more eggs for the per unit. So it's an emissions intensity. So we have to focus on productivity, but that's the context we're in. But at the same time, bring this lens of climate adaptation and mitigation. And we're doing that through not silver bullets. We're doing that through good science that underpins things like improved genetics. You can exploit the variation in a dairy herd and find animals that are more efficient. And so you select those animals and you breed with those animals, and you can reduce the footprint of that dairy herd over time. You can feed those animals material, fodder of high quality, or that contains compounds that will reduce the process of methanogenesis, so that it reduces by 30, 40, 50% the amount of methane that's coming out of an animal's mouth. It doesn't come out of the other end, by the way. It's out of this end. The other areas are, vaccinations. We do large vaccination programs across Africa, Asia, things like foot and mouth or East Coast fever, so on, PPR. These things have a big effect on the animal populations, but they also have almost a direct effect on emissions and productivity of those animals. So we have to start linking these animal health issues also to this emissions adaptation story. Now, the question also was about pastoralism. Pastoralism, I just came from a drylands event as well, and pastoralism, drylands cover 40% of the Earth's surface. So we're talking about a pretty big footprint, and several million people rely on pastoralism, livestock keeping, agropastoralism, transhumanist systems, nomadic systems for livelihoods. These are very challenging to adjust. There's a lot of socioeconomic challenges in those systems. There's often that's where we see the conflict between herders and farmers. We seem to think that the drylands are a liability, but in many cases, the drylands are fairly well managed. Communities are often connected. They have traditional systems for managing their rangeland systems. And we can build on these sort of approaches. We have an approach called PRM, Participatory Rangeland Management, and joint village land use planning. And it's a lot about trying to link villages together, communities together to manage communal grazing resources. And it is then underpinned by bylaws at the local level, but also by national laws. So there's a whole range of almost indigenous knowledge that we can build on. But there's many pressures on the drylands. We have governments trying to centralize nomadic populations for various reasons. As I said, there's often conflict in these systems. There's often theft. So there's a governance issue there as well. So, but I think, there's really great examples. Getting pastoralists to be linked to markets, because often these pastoral systems are cultural in a way. The animals are a bank account. And there has to be some sort of transition as well to link pastoralists to market systems, but also link them to things like carbon sequestration or biodiversity payments or ecosystem services. These sort of flows of capital, and that's why I'm here this week, is to start to understand the role that climate finance could play in these very remote regions as well. So that, yeah, I hope that was helpful.
Wonderful,
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Really interesting. I mean, interesting kind of different ways to approach the livestock sector, from the increases in productivity through technological innovation, but also through the need to be very sensitive to governance, to inequality, to historical marginalization, and the threats to rangeland using pastoralists. Matt, your work focuses very much on small island developing states and the political economy of small island developing states. We heard a little bit earlier from Eddie about some of the particularities that SIDS face in transitioning their food systems within this just transition framework. But your research has shown that just transition as a concept has important limitations for small island developing states, which are small, uniquely exposed and marginalized within global governance structures. What specific reforms at the global level do you think we need to see to deliver a just transition that's really appropriate for SIDS?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I'll take a step back to answer that, and I'll probably answer it in quite an abstract way to begin with, if that's okay. So I'm also one of the directors of the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiative, RESI, which is based here at ODI, and we've done a fair bit of work in recent years looking kind of conceptually, theoretically at just transition. We did a report for the British Academy a few years ago, which you can find online quite easily. We also launched yesterday a major report called the State of SIDS report, which is going to be kind of a fairly significant undertaking every couple of years. So what I'm going to say draws a little bit on some of the arguments in those, and also a policy brief that Mariam and I have just published on healthy islands and islanders, which makes one of the points really important about the significance of fisheries within the kind of agrarian landscape, particularly in small islands, right? Because they're coastal societies where people gain much of their living and their protein sources from the sea, which can't really be divorced from the land. But thinking about just transition, yeah, there are some fairly significant problems with the just transition concept as applied to SIDS. So the debates historically have been designed around large industrial economies, so mining, manufacturing, and the labour displacement effects of decarbonisation. But for small islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific and elsewhere, the central challenge is completely different. It's not about how to decarbonise heavy industry. There are one or two exceptions to that, but not many. It's not really about redeploying labour because they don't have much labour in many cases, but it's how to survive while adapting to both accelerating climate change and also the consequence which affects them kind of harder and faster than most other societies, and also the transition itself. There's a sense that global decarbonisation can impose quite significant costs on small island developing states, and those costs are disproportionate. So the climate-induced shocks are disproportionate, and also the costs of transitioning are disproportionate relative to other societies. So one of the arguments that we've made in our work is that SIDS face a kind of triple burden. So firstly, they again have to adapt to accelerating, escalating climate losses and damage. Hurricane Irma in Dominica caused damage amounting to 226% of GDP, which your IED colleagues wrote a terrific report on a couple of years ago. I mean, that's just inconceivable in a larger state, right? You know, no big country experiences a shock that can wipe out more than 2 years GDP and then generate a debt burden of over 150% of GDP that you're still struggling with a decade later. They have to finance kind of costly compliance with global decarbonisation agenda and the regulatory standards that they impose, but they're also carrying often the legacies of historical colonially induced forms of extraction as well. And in the Caribbean, of course, that comes with legacies of slavery and so on. So SIDS face these kind of chronic fiscal constraints. They don't have any fiscal space, again, with a few exceptions. And that makes things really, really difficult, right? So transition already starts from a kind of unjust baseline. They're not even at zero. They're some way back from zero in terms of their starting point. Now, I'm not saying that transition doesn't matter, but I'm just suggesting that it's important to recognise that for SIDS, it mainly amounts to reducing dependence on imported fossil fuel energy. And I think this is a considerably more expensive endeavour with relatively little immediate benefit to them. And this is because, of course, they don't create much in the way of carbon emissions. They're not really responsible for climate change, and therefore mitigation is much less of an immediate priority for them than is adaptation. At the same time, there's been plenty of innovation in many SIDS, right? So Dominica is in the process of bringing online a fairly significant geothermal plant, which is going to eventually produce quite a lot of low-cost energy, renewable energy for other bits of the Caribbean. Seychelles has floating solar panels, but there are fairly significant political economy barriers to greater decarbonisation in many SIDS. And these are things that people often don't recognise. So, for example, some countries have kind of legacy control of their power grids by companies that can trace their history all the way back pretty much to the kind of pre-independence colonial period. Those contracts are such that it's very, very difficult for them to expand the grid sufficiently to then be able to put in place kind of significant amounts of renewables and so on. So just transition is really, really difficult in SIDS. It may even generate new forms of injustice, potentially, depending on how it is implemented. And this is because it may force quite expensive adjustments on them to achieve this kind of global mitigation for which they bear relatively limited responsibility. And the reason those costs are so high is that the sunk costs of embedding significant new infrastructures in very, very small territories are disproportionately higher than they are in bigger countries, right? Because you don't have a significant population to defray those sunk costs amongst. Which is why the cost of statehood is so much higher as well in SIDS than it is in other countries. But it's also more expensive because your original decisions to build earlier fossil fuel-based infrastructures also imposed significant sunk costs as well. So the cost of undoing that is even higher than it is in a bigger country. And what makes it even worse is the fact that because of this chronic fiscal constraint that you're experiencing, you don't have access to the kind of cheap capital that exists in bigger countries, right? So Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, was here last night. She was talking about the relative interest rate that big countries pay on capital, on capital, debt for capital investment in the region of 1 to 3 or 4%, maybe. In the UK, it's actually creeping up a bit because our debt burden is so high at the moment. In many small island developing states, you're talking commercial rates of interest, 14, 15%, sometimes even more. And this is exacerbated in particular in the Caribbean because they don't have access to concessional forms of financing. So transitioning is really, really difficult. And I guess the broader answer to the question, and I'll stop in a sec, Simon, is that the challenge is that this kind of exposes the limits of a kind of universal just transition framework. So where you have these kind of existing approaches that prioritize mitigation, worker retraining, and so on, vulnerable island geographies require equal emphasis on adaptation, debt relief, resilience, and in some places, I would suggest reparatory justice as well. So for many islands, justice in a just transition is inseparable from repairing those kind of historical legacies and ongoing structural inequalities. So we need to take the politics of knowledge around all of this quite seriously. And I think even if you look at the more critical parts of the academic literature, there's quite a big debate going on, I think, about just transition, where you've got a lot of post-colonial thinkers now talking about the need for something much more radical than is conceived in the kind of conventional sort of policy debate around just transition. But even those radical debates still don't travel very easily to SIDS, right? So most of the debate in those kinds of literatures, it's not necessarily looking at the kind of decarbonisation that is of interest in the North. It's looking at kind of the extraction frontier, right? So it's looking at kind of climate colonialism and the implications of lithium mining, let's say, in South America, or places where there are significant agrarian movements, again, in Latin America or maybe parts of Africa. None of that travels very easily to small island developing states because these are not the kinds of challenges they face. They don't have significant agrarian kind of politics. They don't have that kind of extraction that's taking place. So broadly speaking, there needs to be quite a significant rethinking of what this concept means if we're going to apply it in a satisfactory way to SIDS.
Thank you so much, Matt. But you're making me think about the growing interest in deep sea mining, in deep sea oil exploration, and the parlous state of global fisheries for these large ocean states.
That's right, and I think that is precisely where the focus is going to shift in terms of this debate when it comes to SIDS.
Very interesting. We're rapidly approaching the end of time for this session. There's something that has come up for me that links to the session that we had a session yesterday on how to deliver food system transitions in SIDS. And something that emerged from that discussion really struck me, which was, given the particular situation of SIDS being small and many, and facing these challenges around fiscal space and access to finance, that collective action among SIDS, coming together, engaging with financial institutions and other actors, and this is something that we support through FAO, we support SIDS to do through some of the support that we provide them. It also strikes me that collective action is something that is relevant to each of the constituencies that we've been talking about, because informal settlement dwellers, small-scale fishers, pastoralists, and livestock keepers, and people living in SIDS are all at the margins of debates in the UNFCCC and elsewhere where we're talking about agriculture and food systems. Collective action is something very, very dear to our hearts in FAO. We support cooperative movements. We support farmers' movements. We're always thinking about new ways to mobilize collective action and social dialogue. So I think that's something you've left me with, is really the importance and the opportunity, perhaps, through this just transition mechanism process to work with different constituencies across these different geographies and parts of the agri-food system to mobilize collective action. So I want to thank you all. That was really, really informative and fascinating. Thank you so much. We have some time for questions from the floor. I'm not quite sure how we manage this as everybody sat down, but we have some microphones. If you've been, I hope on Mari's instruction, you've been taking down your questions, but please raise a hand if you'd like to put a question to anybody. Please, one here. Yes, madam.
Can you hear me? Hi,
Yeah.
my name is Christiana. I'm an independent consultant for the European Climate Foundation. I have a question for you, Ajit, about your story, because I was really intrigued about your two lives. in the corridors of barn and then underground in on your land. Because obviously I'm hearing, when I talk to other farmers or other civil society organizations, there can be frustrations around the fact that multilateral processes like the COPs, the G7, the G20, even when they capture the right elements, they do not translate on the ground. There's no real impact on the ground from diplomacy to actual change. So I was just curious about your story and just your argument on why you think other farmers, if I'm talking to farmers, why they should be involved in these processes, and what's your perspective about it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking that question. And the reason we stay engaged at this international process is exactly the kind of conversations we are having. It's about setting the framework. It's about having the right narrative. It's about having the right direction. And that does inform how resources are allocated. It does inform the kind of policy processes that we have and who gets involved. And everything that we talked here is absolutely relevant. But it has to be backed with implementation on ground, the real flow of money. If we do not point out that where most of the money is going, as I said, barely 2% of climate finance is going to smallholder farmers. That's not acceptable. European Union now has started talking about agroecology much more, and it took several decades to have that idea being picked up by several governments. Now we are looking at UNFCEC, which is referring to this. Otherwise, industrial agriculture is what takes all the space. So these conversations are important, but not in itself. We need to also create models. And of course, I didn't want to take a lot of time, but just to emphasize a bit more, when we were pushed by farmers to go back to cities and do something which can make their farming more sustainable, another thing that we learned is how to make the idea very, very simple. And so we were not just talking about organic, we were talking about eat right. And not just about non-pesticide, but also eating local, eating fresh, eating seasonal, talking about the health benefits. If I can promote a little bit more, you can check our Instagram channel. It's Eat Right Basket, and you will see we talk about everything. We also tell consumers on the Environment Day that thank you for eating organic. By eating organic, you are helping the environment. So then you also need to create those models on ground, and also at the same time working with farmers to revive traditional seeds, also to look at what are the traditional practices which are zero energy and low energy. So there's a lot that needs to happen, and being in this space helps because then you are having a two-way process, learning from farmers, informing the policy process, and making sure whatever being discussed at the international level goes to the ground. And one more thing I wanted to say now that you've given me a microphone, I'm very inspired by Milagre's the scale of work that you shared, and a lot of similarities that we also see. You talked about social enterprise. Now that's another thing which doesn't get discussed in the policy space as much. Either we are talking about large corporations or we are talking about smallholder farmers. Social enterprises have a very important role to play, and that's how we decided to set ourselves up. Because this is a long term. This is not a project which can be supported for 2 years, 3 years. It requires long-term work. You need to do it in a very entrepreneurial manner. Otherwise, you can't really succeed. We just celebrated 10 years, and it took us a long time to really get finances, and we have been putting our own resources. There's no ecosystem to help social enterprises who are actually trying to bridge what is being discussed at the top level, what is required, and what farmers actually need at that scale. So there's a huge gap between that, and that's what I'm trying to do. And yeah, once we do that, I'm sure we can also enjoy some banana wine that we were talking.
Gentleman in green.
Yes, thank you. My name is Julian, recently relocated back to London, but I was in the US for the last decade working in the food as medicine space, which is a form of health education and demand creation in the food space by giving people access to fruits and vegetables and healthy food as funded through the healthcare system and referring through the healthcare system. And I mention all that because it's one of the powerful ways to bring us closer to healthy food. I had a question for primarily Harjeet, but potentially also Jasmine, which is, can you go into more detail about generating demand for agroecological or regenerative foods. And I'm also curious about what are some of the assets or challenges of informal markets in creating that demand. I would say that across the board, we are price-sensitive consumers who are often unwilling to pay more for something that might be produced more sustainably. And I also think about how in informal markets, there may be differences in the way that we package and label and certify foods, and how do we tell that story to create that demand?
An excellent question. And I think the challenge in the food system is often around the margins and the economies of scale that large commercial enterprises can leverage in order to squeeze out small producers. I'm sure this is something that you're struggling with. So Harjeet and then Jasmine.
Jasmine, so, okay, I shouldn't take much time. But from our own experience that when you talk to consumers, and I'll be very blunt, you can't sell a farmer story to a consumer to begin with. We tried, it doesn't work. In an urban space, they want a delivery that can match Amazon's, and we have something called big baskets and blinkits. Why they have a name called Blinkit? Because you blink and it's there in 10-minute delivery. It has opened a whole quick commerce field, a new terminology, and it's working. So you're talking to consumers who are getting efficient service and good quality products on their tips. So in that context, you can't just sell stories of how farmers are suffering and crops are failing. That comes much later once you have them through of course, health is a great entry point. That's how we start. But then you have to provide better service in terms of giving them choice. We call ourselves Eat Right Basket, and you can check our website, eatrightbasket.com. It is as good as a commercial website. We had to, and it was huge amount of unlearning we've had. And coming from an NGO sector, we thought if we talk about the emotional stories of farmers, it's going to help. Sorry, it did not. So you have to function in a market the way market works. And then you bring in education, then you keep them on board, then you talk about what heat wave is doing to crops and how organic farming is helping the soil. Only then it matters. And we were also part of small organic markets. We were going there every Sunday. I'll be honest, it didn't help. You have to do it with a very commercial approach, but with a heart at the right place. And also giving farmers a good price so that you can sustain them and keeping the margins low, which is what we are trying to do. So, we have lost money, but farmers have become rich, that I can tell you. And consumers are more healthier.
Thanks. I think maybe I'll just make 2 points to add to that, which maybe more from the urban perspective. One is a bit about sort of the untapped potential of cities to actually be market drivers in terms of the powers that they often have. So a couple of colleagues touched on school feeding programs as an example. And that's a really key way that actually a city, by activating its power over the school system, is able to help stimulate the market, because as I think there was alluded to, there's a number of programs that bring local producers together with the school system, and then that generates jobs. And that also has a really key role in lots of other different powers that exist. Procurement, there's a huge municipal cities all over the world have a really large potential on procurement, and you can see that play out in different food systems. But maybe on the more how you reach consumers, and maybe this is a bit more around less on the prices, but more about how you actually inspire people to think differently. What we've seen is that we have an example in Sao Paulo where the city has looked to really add communication into the program that they're doing around sourcing locally. So, very big, like, helping to provide maps to show consumers where their food is coming from, helping to see the chain that they're in. And of course, this is not going into the price element of things, but it also, there is something that really helps to make it real, and then also help make that element of linkages. And from another sector that we work in, so not on the food space, but on the informal discussion, we have it's a really interesting range of good practice from the waste sector around building trust with informal workers in the waste sector, and how you do that, and then also how you have informal populations feel confident in the city as being a broker for that, which is also maybe applicable for this sector, but we can delve into that in another conversation. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jasmine. We are running out of time. I have two questions I'm going to bring to everybody who was in the panels. They're quite interesting questions. One is related to what we've been hearing, and I'm fascinated that we've ended up having quite a lot of discussion about developing markets and driving demand. This is something that we're very actively thinking about at FAO. But if you had to name one policy change that would most directly fix the markets, what would it be, and how do we ensure these kinds of policies are also just policies? And this is from Shobia Kapadia, the director of Land Stewardship Research Institute. And a second one is a provocation from someone called Mark Blackett. Should we invest so much energy to get agriculture on the UNFCCC agenda? Do we really think that's the fastest way to transform national food systems? Input subsidies may be one approach, but there are others. Sorry, then it got a little garbled. Is this the way for us to go? Is this going to deliver real change at national level? So I'll leave those questions open to everybody, and then we will move to closing remarks. Anybody want to take those on? How do we fix the markets? Yes, Ruchi.
I think we've talked about part of it, right? So we've talked about some of the local territorial markets. There's a lot of work happening there. We've talked about institutional levers, whether it's schools. I mean, Denmark, everyone talks about Denmark. I mean, we need more examples beyond Denmark, right? The 10% or, the cities, so amazing, right? And then I think a new threat around this is really ultra-processed foods and how much they are getting into our institutional markets, right? School meals, we are doing some work, our members are funding some work in Brazil, really understanding how much like ultra-processed food companies are trying to get their products in schools. In the UK, Dolly was speaking yesterday around ultra-processed foods as well. So unless like there is we move away from some of these, and create markets which are more for fresh, whole foods, we will come back to this, right? So it's not only about, but it's about what kind of foods as well in the market. I know we always talk about examples around like taxation, but really thinking through consumer education as well. So there's some amazing work happening around linking ultra-processed foods with ultra-processed animals as well, because actually currently a lot of our food has toxins in it. So I just want to, bring this really important sort of topic. And then finally on your other question on, I think it's a political economy question of national subsidies. I mean, this week I was with lots of colleagues from India, from the Natural Farming Coalition Network, and they've said the subsidies in India on fertilizers have doubled. The government will take the hit. So as much as we keep talking about subsidies reform, they are actually now appealing to the farmers to use fertilizers more efficiently. And they're trying to appeal like to shift to natural farming. But as a government, like it's very hard for most governments to remove these subsidies, which again, remember, go to companies, not the farmers. So I think we do have to think about what else can we replace them with.
Thank you, Ruchi. Elizabeth, you have the last word.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think for me, the most important thing, if we are ready to transform the food systems, is to look at everyone in the ecosystem as equal partners, so that we rebalance the power and we create fairness across the entire value chain. Where me as a farmer, I'm also recognized for my contribution that I'm making to nature, for all these practices that we're speaking about. We're talking about agroecology, for example. Are we also thinking about the cost of transitioning that the farmers, for example, are going to go through to be able to realize optimum production? I think once we recognize that and we are able to sit on the same table as equal partners, then we are able to recognize each and everyone's contribution. Then the other thing that I wanted to bring up was the issue of policy shift. I think for me, for example, with the EU Green Deal, when the discussion started, we as Eastern Africa Farmers Federation, we conducted a study on the impact of the EU Green Deal on farmers in East Africa. And we realized that if we don't shift, then we are, in the near future, we are going to be pushed out of the EU market because we will not be complying. So what we've been doing now is to prepare our farmers, for example, on the EU deforestation regulation, on how to comply, looking at of course, going agroecological, because EU is also investing a lot of resources into that. And so we are preparing our farmers for the eventualities that might happen in the near future. So that's why we are promoting all the practices that are nature positive going forward, because we know that's where the future is. Everyone now, especially the middle class, is being mindful of where the food is produced from and what is brought on their table, how it is prepared and how it is put on their table. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And with that, we conclude, but I'm going to hand over to Kaveh Zahedi for some closing remarks before we wind up.
I know, it's just a bit formal. You know, we're having a nice conversation. I'll go stand there behind that thing. It's it feels a bit wrong. Thank you. No, thank you so much. And I won't go for long. I mean, it's impossible to summarize such a rich discussion. Really grateful for everyone's contribution. I think that we do agree that it is important to get agriculture, food systems, all of the issues that we're working on properly recognized in these formal processes, not as an end to itself. And I think the question that came online indicated that. But because actually, at the end of the day, that's what triggers climate finance, right? GCF, Jeff, these are mechanisms, finance mechanisms of the conventions. And it's a way of ensuring that actually we move from the global policy into the on-ground action. So that recognition is important. I think we can all rally to get it done. In doing so, I don't think we need to obsess about terminologies. You know, we saw a couple of weeks ago that agri-food systems causes an allergic reaction in the UNFCCC. We don't need to use that, right? Because it's about the solutions. Yeah, if it's agroforestry, it's agroforestry. If it's agroecology, it's agroecology. It's about the solutions that we can offer in fisheries, in aquaculture, wherever it might be. The second piece is that, I mean, money is an issue. I mean, the means of implementation are critical. Finance, of course, is important. Climate and environment finance will never be enough to transform agri-food systems. We know that we need around 1.3 trillion a year to do this transformation. It's not going to come from climate and environment funding. But what we have found is that funding is an incredibly powerful trigger for change at the country level that can then crowd in the capital markets, it can crowd in the carbon markets, it can help with the realignment, including relooking at national subsidies. And I think that remains a big piece of our action agenda of translating global aspirations into national realities. But I think we got a good reminder today that finance is not always about, you know, green climate fund or big capital markets. It's also about markets, right? Connecting farmers to markets in a sustainable way and increasing, I guess, the understanding and the demand for sustainable products, and maybe the willingness to pay the premium for those products, which is not the case right now. And the conversation right now that we're having on fertilizers is a case in point, yeah? Green fertilizers, biofertilizers are still more expensive than the chemical fertilizers. We as consumers are not willing to pay that price in our food. The other piece that we have to try to address together is, I think, what somebody called layers of invisibility. Was it you? It was beautiful. Layers of, and it's true, right? Because we're battling to get agri-food. You know, you, Mariam, we're battling to get agriculture and food in the UN process, not just in the UNFCCC, in the biological diversity, and Convention on Desertification elsewhere. But there's layers. You're absolutely right. We've talked about the role that women play and how visible or invisible that is. The role that small-scale farmers or fishers. By the way, in FAO, whenever we say agriculture, it includes all of that, you know, right? It includes aquaculture, fisheries, livestock, forestry. So we don't say it all, but that's absolutely included, the layers of invisibility in terms of where the cities stand and how much more important they're going to be quite soon, right? And the role that consumers in that play. So these layers of invisibility are something that I think collectively we are trying to address. Not that nothing is happening, and we heard about many examples, right, that have been shared with us. I guess that the challenge that we have is how do we take what still feels a little bit like niche examples, right, that seem to be small experiments into the scale that we're talking about, the scale of ambition that we have in terms of building resilience, in terms of mitigation, in terms of food security as we move forward. And I don't think we've managed to resolve that. Part of that challenge is around finance. Part of it is around political recognition. Part of it is around the markets and the consumers. And I think that's the work that we have going forward. Last but not least, this is a critical moment, and it's a moment of crisis. But these moments of crisis haven't necessarily in the past brought transformational change. COVID being a case in point, right? It was great because suddenly people realized that the food doesn't magically appear in supermarkets, right? That there's a farmer somewhere back there at the end of that, but it disappeared, right? It evaporated. And I think it's the same with the issue of fertilizers. Can that be the transition or not to a different way of doing things? The emphasis is right now is how do we quickly reopen markets and get back to where we were before? And I think that's a big part of our conversation. How can we make sure that this moment of opportunity, if I could call it that, with extreme heat, with an El Nino year, with what's going on with the war and the Straits of Hormuz, all of these which have massive impacts on our food, agriculture, on our rural communities, how can we capitalize on that as a community? And that's exactly what we look forward to doing with all of you. And with that, just again, big thank you to ODI for partnering with us on this conversation today, and it's a signal of intent for much more work with each and every one of you who've been kind enough to give us your time. Thank you.
That was actually the closer, but Mariam suggested that I should perhaps pick up one point. And that is about our work program going forward and how we take this agenda forward. I think there's sort of an outline of an agenda that we see here. There's a lot of knowledge very clearly that is coming across about how resilience is built, how policies can take into account the local knowledge. There's also a question of how the global level, how these fora that we're talking about could actually relate to this. So we could have we could be tremendously successful and push and get the politics right and get these issues on the agenda of the UNFCCC, of other places, and fight epic battles in those fora, and then manage to get a paragraph into some outcome statement, and then nothing happens. And I'm familiar with that from various other fora. So I spent years of my life getting paragraphs on trade into G20 and G7 statements. And those were just perfunctory, protectionism happened anyway. So how do we make it relevant if we do manage to get this on the agenda? And there are certain aspects that are fairly clear. And I think you mentioned that, you mentioned finance. I think on finance and how the global financial institutions handle, how they focus on these issues, there is something where these global fora can make a difference. Demand, I think demand is sort of an angle, it's a handle that is easier to deal with than supply in the context of agri-food business and resilience. How do we shape the agenda of these fora so that they deal with those things in which they can have traction? How do we work on the transmission mechanisms? How do we make sure that, and to take an example, I worked at the World Bank for some of my life, that the institutions, when they then decide on what they do, feel in some way concerned by what has been decided in the UNFCCC or what has been decided in other fora. that link is very often missing. So if we want to move forward, and what sort of focus for our work agenda over the coming months might be that we try to identify how to form the agenda for these fora in a way that they can actually have traction. So with that, I want to also thank you again for this collaboration. Thanks for this really amazing conversation that we had here today.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I'm not going to be the person between you and lunch, but please feel free to approach the panelists, to approach us, and mingle and network outside for a few minutes, exchange cards, and let this conversation not end here. Thank you so much.